Test, test, test. The Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, they can email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. Again, that's documentsti@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement. First, thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'm eager to hear from you on the issues local communities are facing in their efforts to address the nation's water and wastewater infrastructure needs. Specifically, I'm most interested in hearing your insights on water infrastructure financing, especially the current condition of the Clean Water State Revolving Funds, or SRFs, as they are commonly known. Our clean water infrastructure is something most Americans don't think about but rely on 24/7. But ask anyone who has ever dealt with a sewer backup how important wastewater infrastructure is. In many cases, and in many communities, these water and wastewater systems are long past their design life and in need of critical repairs, upgrades, or total replacement. As a result, leaks and blockages are all too common across the nation and represent a massive waste of a vital resource. These needs are especially urgent for hundreds of communities trying to fix the problems of combined sewer overflows and sanitary sewer overflows. Wastewater infrastructure deficiencies are particularly acute in many small and rural communities. There are more than 16,000 private and public wastewater treatment systems nationwide, and approximately 80% serve communities with populations of 10,000 or less. For example, in my district, there are almost 100 communities with 1,000 residents or less, including the town of Chadbourne in Columbus County. Chadbourne, interestingly enough, has wastewater systems as old as their date of incorporation, which was 1883. The Clean Water SRF program has allowed them to maintain their systems while they pursue long-term solutions. According to the EPA's last Clean Water Needs Survey report to Congress, the total documented needs for sustainable wastewater infrastructure combined with sewer overflow and sanitary sewer overflow correction and stormwater management nationwide are at least $270 billion over the next 2 decades. In my home state of North Carolina alone, there's a documented need of $11 billion for clean water projects. To further underscore the need, coastal and low-lying inland communities in southeastern North Carolina experience frequent storms resulting in flooded rivers and watersheds, which often leave water and drainage systems in need of total repair and future mitigation. These investments are expensive and cannot be handled by simply authorizing and appropriating the same or larger amounts of federal funds. The Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act recognized the importance of the Clean Water SRF program, but simply pump more money at the problem without addressing some fundamental shortfalls. While federal, state, and local investments are necessary, new approaches are needed to solve these problems. Integrated planning and greater regulatory flexibility can help communities struggling to address their needs and meet compliance mandates, while also reducing financial burdens currently levied on ratepayers. When the Clean Water SRF program was created in 1987, the authors understood states and localities are the experts in addressing their own clean water infrastructure challenges. By setting up loan programs, states and localities would be able to leverage more financial resources for decades to come, much easier than relying on direct appropriations. So it is important that we maintain and abide by the intent of this long-standing loan structure to continue responsibly addressing wastewater infrastructure needs decades into the future. To divert more and more of these funds to grants will make the program unsustainable and in the end, help no one. The current set-asides for grants and grant substitutes passed in IJA will ultimately be harmful to the program, slowly draining the funds states have been able to leverage for decades under the traditional low-interest loan structure. When combined with unfunded mandates and burdensome regulations driving up baseline cost, it puts the long-term viability of the Clean Water SRF in question. Wastewater infrastructure is incredibly important for my constituents and those of every member of Congress. The Clean Water SRF is a great example of good public policy that helps keep wastewater costs down and provides reliable service for many communities and ratepayers around the country. In order to maintain a good clean water infrastructure well into the future, a robust and effective program is key. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how we can improve our clean water infrastructure, protect against environmental degradation, keep wastewater costs low for ratepayers, and address the challenges brought about by recent legislative changes surrounding the Clean Water SRF program. So I yield back and now recognize Ranking Member Napolitano for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a letter to insert into the record from the Union of Operating Engineers.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much for holding today's hearing to showcase the critical clean water investments made by the bipartisan Bureau of Infrastructure Law, known as the BIL. Thank you for being a great partner, Mr. Chair. Last Congress, House Democrats worked with the Biden administration to provide the largest investment in our nation's crumbling infrastructure in over a generation. With each dollar invested and each new water infrastructure project implemented every day, Americans in your district and mine realize the benefits of the transformational bipartisan infrastructure law with a cleaner and safer water and more resilient and more livable environment. For example, my congressional district in LA County is using bill funding to carry out a long list of long-awaited projects that benefit our community, our local economy, and our businesses and industries that rely on clean, safe, and resilient water for their success. Wastewater for groundwater recharge at Hanson Spreading Grounds in San Fernando Valley, a major source of water supply for the city's drinking water. Mr. Chairman, these are just a few thousands of examples of critical water-related investments happening all across America because of BIL. And because House Democrats specifically tailored these investments to address unique affordability concerns facing many minority, rural, and tribal communities, all Americans, regardless of income, can benefit from these investments and have access to clean, safe water and reliable drinking and wastewater services. Yet, Mr. Chairman, I remain concerned with the direction our current House leadership is taking towards sustaining these critical investments in the future. For example, the majority party has already pulled back from the bipartisan budget agreement reached earlier this year to avoid a governmental default, and now, on the precipice of a pointless government shutdown, is advocating for deep, draconian cuts to programs that benefit hardworking Americans. I am very strongly opposed to the proposed project, 40% cut to EPA's budget, advanced by the majority, and the likely equivalent reduction in protecting our clean waters. Mr. Chairman, as our witness today will reiterate, the strength of our American economy is reliant on the clean water. It is a key ingredient for manufacturing, farming, food processing, small business development, tourism, and recreational businesses. If we do not protect our nation's water, we will have a negative impact on our business as they will not have the high-quality water they need for production and growth. The decline of water quality will also require consumers, businesses, and residents to pay more in water utility bills to treat water before it comes to the tap. Mr. Chairman, House Democrats probably support continued investments in our clean water future. Now is not the time to pull back on federal investments in our wastewater infrastructure. I welcome our panelists here today and look forward to their valuable testimony, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. While I have the opportunity, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter sent on September the 27th, 2023 by the Western Governors Association addressed to myself and Ranking Member Napolitano outlining the Western Governors' collective policy recommendations for clean water infrastructure financing. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Rouser and Ranking Member Napolitano, for holding this hearing on clean water infrastructure financing, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. I have to admit I'm a little disappointed walking down the hallways here and seeing the big lineup outside and then realizing they weren't here for the clean water infrastructure hearing. I do think it's an important issue, perhaps not as important as other things, but I'm glad we're having this hearing and the folks at home can participate otherwise. In June, I joined EPA's Assistant Administrator for Water, Radhika Fox, in my district in Ferndale, Washington, to announce over $278 million in funding for water infrastructure for American Indian tribes and Alaskan Native villages. These historic investments were the largest ever made by the EPA to tribes through regular appropriations funding. Clean water is a human right that historically underserved communities, including tribal communities, have lacked access to for far too long. Investments like these, made possible by the bipartisan infrastructure law, will improve lives, level the playing field for communities, and create jobs. In the BIL, on a bipartisan basis, Congress affirmed its commitment to water infrastructure with significant investments. $14.4 billion in federal dollars for upgrading wastewater systems, preventing pollution, and supporting restoration programs in places like Puget Sound and the Salish Sea. These investments are critical, providing a lifeline to communities across the country struggling to maintain water quality. Members who voted for the BIL voted for clean water. House Democrats have consistently supported investments in water infrastructure to protect public health and the work that the EPA and other agencies do in support of this clean water mission. In contrast, the House Republican Interior Appropriations Bill proposes a 2/3 reduction in funding for the Clean Water SRF, a cut of over $1 billion. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund, or the SRF, has been the linchpin of efforts to protect and improve water quality over 3 decades. I suspect that's why, despite differences, all the witnesses appearing before us today agree on the importance of Clean Water SRF funding. In just the last 2 years in the district I represent, the Clean Water SRF has been used to upgrade aging sewer and water equipment, improve nutrient removal capabilities, and protect local groundwater supply. And I have toured far too many to count wastewater facilities in my district. It's the things you get to do when you're a member of Congress. And I can assure you that there's plenty more work that needs to be done. From a $1.4 million SRF loan in Whatcom County to a $200,000 grant to the Lemhi Tribe for engineering reviews, the Clean Water SRF is making a difference. Established in 1987, it's been critical for countless communities striving to upgrade and maintain their water and wastewater infrastructure. It's provided low-interest loans and grants to states and municipalities, allowing them to undertake vital projects that protect public health, preserve our natural resources, and stimulate economic growth. Unfortunately, we have at times neglected to invest in our infrastructure. Aging pipes, polluted waterways, and increasingly frequent extreme weather events have stretched our water systems and wastewater systems to a breaking point. The most recent EPA report on wastewater infrastructure needs estimated we would need $271 billion over the next 20 years to continue to meet federal standards for water quality. These challenges are not limited to one region. They affect communities from coast to coast and across the political spectrum. Under the bipartisan infrastructure law, $11.7 billion in supplemental appropriations for the Clean Water SRF will be provided through 2026, on top of what should be continued in regular appropriations. These investments are a down payment on transforming our nation's wastewater infrastructure, and their significance cannot be overstated. This funding will enable communities large and small to embark on a new era of water infrastructure projects that will modernize our systems, improve water quality, and ensure the safety and health of citizens. The impact of this investment goes beyond the immediate benefits of improved water quality. It will create jobs, it will stimulate local economies, it will support American business. The bipartisan infrastructure law recognizes that investing in our water infrastructure is an investment in our future. So I thank you again, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. I look forward to the testimony.
Thank the gentleman. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses, and again, thank you for being here today. First, we have Ms. Lori Johnson, Assistant Chief, Financial Service Division at the Oklahoma Water Resources Board, here on behalf of the Council of Infrastructure Financing Authorities. We have Mr. Todd Swingle, CEO and Executive Director of Toho Water Authority in Kissimmee, Florida, on behalf of the National Association of Clean Water Agencies. And we have Mr. Jim Proctor, Senior VP of Legal and External Affairs and General Counsel at McWane Incorporated, on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And last but certainly not least, Ms. Rebecca Hammer, with the Deputy Director for Federal Water Policy at the Natural Resources Defense Council. So briefly, let me explain the lighting system, which I'm sure you're already fully aware. Green means go, yellow means you got about 30 seconds left, and red means wrap it up as quick as you can. I ask unanimous consent that the witness's full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, and the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to roughly 5 minutes. With that, Ms. Johnson, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Rouser and ranking members Napolitano and Larson, and members of the committee for allowing me to testify before you today. My name is Lori Johnson, and I'm the Assistant Chief of the Financial Assistance Division of the Oklahoma Water Resources Board. I'm testifying today on behalf of the Council of Infrastructure Financing Authorities, also known as CIFA, which is a national organization that represents the clean water SRFs around the country. Clean water SRFs around the country wanted me to leave you with 3 take-home messages today. First, we love loans. I know I'm probably one of the few witnesses to testify to that, but the SRFs love subsidized loans because they are a model of fiscal responsibility. Federal funding is used over and over in perpetuity to meet the never-ending need to repair, rehabilitate, and replace aging infrastructure. For example, federal appropriations from the 1990s is being used today to finance billions of dollars in infrastructure projects. Without loan repayments, these water projects would likely cost more or wouldn't be built at all. We also love SRF subsidized loans because they foster fiscal responsibility. To qualify for a loan, these communities have to have their finances in order. And the SRFs love subsidized loans because they save money, real money. Subsidized loans can save as much as 2/3 in interest payments, which is essentially a grant equivalent. Financing costs which would otherwise be passed on to ratepayers through utility bills. Second, the cumulative impact of federal mandates is increasing the cost of water infrastructure and threatening the affordability of SRF subsidized loans. Since 2009, a growing number of federal mandates has eroded the savings from SRF subsidized loans. Today, federal mandates impact many aspects of water infrastructure projects, including planning and design, procurement of professional services, wages for construction workers, and the eligibility of construction materials, all of which impact the cost of the project. While well-intentioned public policy, these federal mandates may not be achieving the goals originally envisioned by Congress, and more importantly, the goals of the Clean Water Act, which is to maintain, restore, and protect the quality of the nation's waters. The Clean Water SRFs urge the committee to fully evaluate the impact of federal mandates on SRF subsidized loans, specifically whether these mandates are increasing protection for public health and the environment, which are the goals of the SRF programs. Third, the Clean Water SRFs urge the committee to establish a separate authorization for congressional earmarks. For the last 2 years, the Appropriations Committee has diverted more than $1.3 billion in annual federal funding from the Clean Water SRFs to pay for congressional earmarks. While supplemental funding in the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act is mitigating the immediate damage of those cuts, shifting federal funding from loans to grants will have lasting effects on the nation's ability to finance water infrastructure in the future, not to mention undermining the transformation potential of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Additionally, the Clean Water SRFs face a fiscal cliff when the short-term funding ends in just 3 years. Establishing a separate authorization would provide greater transparency to annual federal funding for the Clean Water SRFs, which is essential for managing the SRF project pipeline. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Clean Water SRFs. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Mr. Swingle.
Good morning, Chairman Rouser, ranking members Larson and Napolitano, and to all the members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, NACWA, the nation's leading organization of publicly owned clean water utilities. It's an honor to be here today. My name is Todd Swingle, and I am the CEO and Executive Director of Toho Water Authority in Kissimmee. Toho provides water, wastewater, and reuse water services to approximately 430,000 residents and visitors of Central Florida. I'm also a board member of NACWA. Communities across the country face a growing array of complex water challenges, including increasingly stringent compliance obligations. As we strive to deliver on the public health and environmental protection outcomes that our communities expect and deserve, Clean Water State revolving funds, integrated water resource planning, and the remaining topics of my testimony are critical. Since 1987, SRFs have served as the primary federal financing tool, helping local communities more affordably meet Clean Water Act compliance obligations. The Clean Water SRF's low interest rates are particularly helpful in times such as these when interest rates for other borrowing options are elevated. In Florida and across the country, SRF investments have helped both urban and rural utilities to treat wastewater to higher standards, improve energy efficiency, capture and reuse biogas, enhance beneficial reuse, reduce nitrogen and phosphorus loading, and address wet weather and resiliency challenges. Building on the Clean Water SRFs, the 5-year $11.7 billion Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act serves as a historic investment in clean water infrastructure. However, this was intended to be a one-time infusion of capital to the Clean Water SRFs, in addition to the ongoing annual appropriations. Likewise, the return of community project funding provides an alternative option for communities to address the rapidly widening funding gap. Growing a portfolio of accessible funding approaches is critical to delivering on our promise of public health and a clean water environment. With all due respect to the committee, the current Clean Water SRF investments proposed in the House's FY 2024 appropriations bill are not adequate to achieve these goals. It is imperative that Congress fully appropriate the amounts authorized under the IIJA and fund earmarks from a source other than the Clean Water SRF. At the top of the list of challenges for utilities is PFAS. Utilities embrace a role that we play in removing PFAS under Clean Water Act science-based regulatory processes, but it is the actual polluters who alone must be held liable. While the IIJA allocated $1 billion in mandatory federal funding for emerging contaminants, the Clean Water SRF is designed for capital infrastructure investments. Today, the need for many utilities includes PFAS monitoring, assessments, and pretreatment efforts. It is important that Congress provide a legislative fix to allow for flexible access to this funding for these needs. Another important provision of the IIJA is the requirement that 49% of the mandatory dollars be allocated as a subsidy, essentially forgivable loans or grants for disadvantaged communities. To date, we have heard that numerous states have updated their definition of disadvantaged communities, consistent with EPA's recommendation to consider multiple factors like unemployment, how water and sewer rates compare to the lowest quintile income, and ensuring funds reach urban areas of poverty as well as rural and small communities. We recommend that Congress continue to monitor the success of these subsidies and remain open to providing further direction. In addition to funding, the regulatory approaches are instrumental in delivering effective, affordable solutions. Furthering acceptance of integrated planning is another key way that regulators can help communities stretch limited infrastructure dollars. NACWA greatly appreciates the bipartisan leadership of this committee in getting integrated planning codified to the Clean Water Act in 2018. We look forward to working with Congress and EPA to help state regulators further enhance this critical tool. Finally, it is imperative that Congress enact sensible, targeted reforms to the Clean Water Act to provide regulatory certainty needed for utilities to effectively and affordably plan and invest in long-term capital projects to meet compliance obligations. Without regulatory certainty, investments such as those made through the Clean Water SRF will not have the full positive impact intended. In closing, growing the water infrastructure funding portfolio, maintaining and growing the foundational Clean Water SRFs, and addressing the other challenges, including integrated planning and regulatory certainty, are critical as utilities strive to continue providing essential clean water services to our communities. NACWA appreciates the ongoing engagement by the committee on these critical issues. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I would be happy to answer any questions from the committee.
Mr. Proctor.
Chairman Rouser, Ranking Member Napolitano, Ranking Member Larson, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity and the invitation to be here today to talk about clean water infrastructure financing. My name is Jim Proctor. I'm with McWayne Incorporated. We're a privately owned company that for over 175 years has provided the basic building blocks of the country's water infrastructure. We employ more than 6,000 team members across the country in 14 states and 25 manufacturing facilities. Over the past several years, Congress has passed monumental legislation that includes substantial investments in water infrastructure. However, several problems have emerged that could jeopardize the ability of the states and the private sector to realize the opportunities that Congress intended to create. One such obstacle is the lack of regulatory clarity in many critical areas. For example, the authorization for the funds for emerging contaminants expires in December 2027. However, EPA is yet to issue effluent limitation guidelines for any PFAS. Knowing the standards that utilities must meet is critical to the design of waste treatment and other projects and evaluating and selecting the appropriate technology. These delays in announcing standards are putting utilities and state agencies in a squeeze that could preclude the funding of important projects. Second, earmarks for specific projects demonstrate responsiveness to constituent needs and offer an important tool to members of Congress to respond to those needs. But they should be additive to the existing SRF allocations. More than 1,400 projects were earmarked for funding in the SRF appropriations for 22 and 23, constituting the majority of the funding for 2023. Although the funding must attach within 2 years, to date, fewer than 200 of those 1,400 projects for 2022 and 2023 have applied for approval, and fewer still have been approved. Earmarks that aren't additive reduce the funding available for other non-earmarked SRF projects with acute need, reduce the funds available for program administration, and create uncertainty in the planning process, all of which slows the allocation of funding across all projects. But in addition, delays in the allocation of this earmarked funding also creates uncertainty in the private sector, which discourages the capital investment needed to ensure that supply chains are able to provide the critical products and equipment to meet the needs of project owners. For example, our industry saw a significant post-COVID surge in demand that created production and delivery backlogs for a short period of time. The infrastructure programs passed by Congress, though, signaled an assurance of continued demand that prompted us to significantly increase our capital expenditures and expand capacity, not only to eliminate those existing backlogs, but also to position our plants to serve the needs created by the infrastructure programs. However, the slow commencement of projects and uncertainties about the programs has resulted in a dramatic decrease in demand that's forced us to consider reducing production, expansion plans, and associated employment. Also, permitting delays have slowed the construction of expansion projects, a situation that will be aggravated by the possible adoption of EPA's new PM 2.5 standards. Because many other producers face the same situations, when projects eventually do commence, the demand for essential products with which to build those projects will hit the market in a large but compressed surge that manufacturers could be ill-positioned to meet, which could result in delays or cancellations of projects and increased costs. To avoid these problems, we ask the members of this committee to consider extending some of the deadlines applicable to the bipartisan infrastructure law and IRA funding, to engage with EPA to accelerate the rollout of the authorized funding, to increase the availability of much-needed technical assistance, and to ask your colleagues on the Appropriations Committee to support full funding for the SRFs, in addition to whatever earmarks they might deem appropriate. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Hammer.
Thank you, Chairman Rouser, Ranking Members Larson and Napolitano, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. My name is Becky Hammer. I'm the Deputy Director of Federal Water Policy for the Natural Resources Defense Council. NRDC is a nonprofit organization working to protect public health and ensure a safe, sustainable environment for all people. At NRDC, I advocate for policies to ensure that everyone in this country has access to wastewater and stormwater infrastructure that works. No matter where they're located, these systems should provide communities with clean waterways, safe sanitation, and protection from urban flooding without imposing unaffordable costs on families. Unfortunately, that's not the reality for far too many people. Across the United States, polluted runoff and sewage degrade sources of drinking water, while rainwater floods streets and homes. Aging systems are stressed by changing precipitation patterns and population shifts. In some rural areas, a complete lack of sanitation infrastructure has created a public health crisis. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IJA, also known as Bipartisan Infrastructure Law or Bill, this law has too many names, took a significant step toward tackling these problems by providing a critical and historic investment in America's wastewater and stormwater systems. I want to take this opportunity to thank all the members who worked on and supported that legislation. The funding it provided will make a real difference to many communities. Yet, even after this influx of supplemental funds, our country still faces an enormous backlog of clean water infrastructure needs that can be measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars. In many places, state and local resources are simply insufficient to cover these costs. We should not accept communities having to live with health and environmental burdens when we have the ability to help. I ask the members of this committee to work with your colleagues who have responsibility for appropriations to ensure that the Clean Water State Revolving Fund receives the full funding authorized in IJA. Recent proposals to reduce appropriations would undercut this committee's work to provide much-needed resources to cities and towns that have been waiting years or even decades for assistance. I also echo the concerns of the other witnesses about the practice of taking water infrastructure earmarks out of the state allotment. This practice results in unpredictable fluctuations in state funding, frustrates public engagement and long-term planning, and reduces the number of grants available to disadvantaged communities. Any clean water project earmarks should be additional to SRF state allotments. On the subject of disadvantaged communities, IJA's requirement to distribute 49% of the supplemental funds as additional subsidy that does not have to be repaid is a game changer for small, rural, and low-income communities that cannot afford a traditional SRF loan. These communities have faced obstacles to accessing SRF assistance for too long. By asking EPA and the states to make a greater effort to reach them, IJA has created an enhanced awareness of the need to make the program more inclusive moving forward. To build on that progress, Congress should not only maintain existing statutory requirements for additional subsidization, but also raise the limit beyond 30% of the annual capitalization grant, so that states with the financial capacity to distribute more than that can exercise their discretion to do so. At the same time, Congress should provide resources to EPA for technical assistance to help state SRF managers eliminate policy barriers that continue to exclude disadvantaged communities from the program, such as caps on the amount of subsidy an individual applicant can receive. Critically, Congress should also establish a permanent federal water and sewer assistance program. Communities facing affordability challenges may defer implementing infrastructure projects to avoid raising rates on residents. Assistance for low-income households can not only help people afford basic needs like water and sewer service, but also put communities in a better position to access SRF assistance. As Congress works to establish a permanent program, it should also provide additional bridge funding for the temporary LIWAP program that is about to expire. I want to make two final points before I conclude. First, Congress should make the Green Project Reserve a permanent feature of the Clean Water SRF to guarantee continued support for sustainable projects that provide multiple benefits to communities. And second, Congress should work with EPA to improve transparency around IJA spending decisions and SRF funding more generally by publishing project-level data in an online dashboard. The American public deserves to know how these historic funds are being used. I'd be happy to discuss any of these recommendations in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have to say, you all get the gold star, the gold medal, whatever you want. I have never seen 4 panelists stay within 5 minutes. That's staff, have you ever seen all 4 stay within 5 minutes?
And even Nike was under.
I tell you what, y'all, I applaud. Anyway, I can assure you no member of Congress can stay under 5 minutes. So with that, I will allocate 5 minutes to myself. So, Ms. Johnson, I'm going to start with you. Obviously, it's no secret we have an aging infrastructure. The average age is 40, 50 years old. That's just average. I mentioned my town of Chadburn, in my district, that has had a system in place since 1883. My question is this: what do you estimate the total need in the country to be? And then can you talk a little bit about what the investment is as well? Because it's a pretty large gap there. Is the need twice as large as available supply of dollars, 10 times? What's your thought?
I don't know specifically the need of the entire nation off the top of my head. I know in Oklahoma, the last update we had to our comprehensive water plan, we identified an $80 billion infrastructure need over the next 50 years for water and wastewater infrastructure. And since the inception of all of our financing programs, we've funded approximately $6 billion of infrastructure needs. So there is quite a difference. I'm sure that can extrapolate to the entire country's demand for water and wastewater infrastructure.
Well, absolutely. I think it's important to underscore just what a wide gap exists there. And, we must maximize every dollar that we can. It's going to get harder and harder to get the dollars needed, given the nature of the budget situation here in Washington with a $33 trillion debt. It's going to be more and more pressure to cut discretionary dollars because nobody really wants to touch the mandatory spending, which is what really is driving the debt. Let me ask this. In your experience running a Clean Water SRF, what do you see as the easiest hurdle or hurdles to remove to help ensure that we are maximizing each federal dollar?
Well, the SRF programs are a great model for leveraging the federal funding and maximizing capacity in their state. In Oklahoma, we're a leveraged state, so we issue debt in order to meet the demand in our state for infrastructure financing. So as far as hurdles, of course, all of the federal mandates that I mentioned earlier are increasing the cost of projects while not necessarily meeting the intention of the federal mandate or the goals of the Clean Water Act. So removing or revising those federal mandates after, a lot of these federal mandates have been in place for more than a decade. So we're looking at those mandates to make sure that they have had the transformational gap that Congress intended when they proposed those mandates. And if they're not meeting that intention, then maybe it's time to revise them.
Let me ask this, and I'll open it up for the rest of the panel. Are we concerned that maybe we're putting too much money towards grants, movement that way that's going to shortchange us long term?
I believe so. While it is very important for the very small disadvantaged communities to have an opportunity for grant funding to finance their infrastructure needs, grant funding can have a negative impact on infrastructure financing and public health and the environment protection because large grant programs like we're seeing currently, communities rely on that and delay their infrastructure projects, hoping that they're the next in line to receive a grant that may or may not come their way. So while they're waiting for grant funding, their infrastructure is not meeting the compliance requirements for the Clean Water Act.
Thank you. Mr. Swingle and Mr. Proctor, I'm running out of time here, but real quickly, are there any specific suggestions for Congress as it relates to permitting reform? This is a subject that we're taking a real close look at, either one of you. And turn on your microphone.
We represent 4 different member governments, and having flexibility to make sure that we're using our dollars as wisely as possible. So tying into integrated planning and also funding flexibility as well is absolutely critical.
Thank you. My time has expired. Ms. Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To all the panel, And thank you for recognizing the historic clean water investment contained in the BIF. More than ever, sustaining the federal commitment to robust infrastructure investments require constant attention. And as the chairman stated, we have an aging infrastructure. Do you support cutting clean water infrastructure investment by roughly 2/3, as recommended by my colleagues? And what will be the consequences of such a cut?
No, we do not support cuts to the SRF programs. In fact, we suggest fully funding the SRFs to the full authorization levels.
Mr. Swingle?
And we agree that funding at full authorization levels is important. Having a diverse funding portfolio, as I stated, is absolutely critical. We are continuing to see increasing regulations, and the current inflationary environment in the utility sector is as significant or more profound than many other areas of the economy.
Thank you. Mr. Proctor?
As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we agree as well. Two things to keep in mind. Without full funding, the states are deprived of critical administrative resources that they need to implement the programs, whether they're regular programs or earmarked. But another thing is, if the funds aren't fully funded, they don't continue to revolve, where the money gets lent out and then it gets paid back and then it's available for future projects as well.
Ms. Hammer?
We absolutely would not support cuts. As the other witnesses have stated, the demand far exceeds the available resources. Just in one state, Texas, last year, they had $378 million to distribute through their Clean Water SRF, but received requests for $2.8 billion worth of projects. So they could fund only about 1/8 of the existing demand. And now that's, every state has different needs, but it's clear that the demand is there, and cutting available funds would have huge impacts.
Thank you. Mr. Swingle and Ms. Hammer, last Congress, we worked closely with your organization to reauthorize the Clean Water State Revolving Fund for the first time since its enactment. There were, however, some provisions not included in the final package, including increasing the percentage of funds awarded as grants rather than loans. Do your organization support increasing amounts of base SRF funds to go to our communities as grant or loan substitutes?
Let me make sure I understand the question. Are you asking if we support increased grant funding and loan forgiveness?
Yes, ma'am, but I asked the question, Mr. Swingle and Ms. Hammer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we support the grant funding as proposed in IIJA. We think that particularly, again, in this current pace of change for utilities, that those grant funds do play a significant role, particularly for disadvantaged communities. We often as utilities think in terms of not years, but decades when we're making infrastructure investments. And because of the pace of change of regulatory environment and those cost changes, the grants do particularly help those small disadvantaged communities in adapting to supporting their ratepayers.
Thank you, Ms. Hammer.
Additional subsidization or grants are really the only option for a large number of communities, as well as certain types of projects. For example, important non-point source projects that don't have a revenue stream available to repay a loan would not be possible without additional subsidization. Not all states operate separate grant programs that could make up the difference if additional subsidization weren't available. To me, it really goes to the core of what the purpose of this program is. Do we really want to have a fund that revolves in perpetuity but doesn't help the communities that actually need assistance? The entire purpose of this program is to help communities implement infrastructure projects that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So if anything, we should be distributing more funding as subsidy.
Thank you. Mr. Proctor, what has been the single tangible benefit or requirement to utilize American-made iron and steel in clean water infrastructure projects for iron and steel industry in the U.S.? Do you think this provision fundamentally increases the cost of clean water projects?
Well, speaking on behalf of McWane, I'll talk with respect to American Iron and Steel, which is the program most applicable to our industry. And to quote EPA, it's been a resounding success. It's increased capacity, it's brought production back to the U.S., it's increased jobs, it's done everything that it is intended to do. And to give an example from our industry, there used to be dozens of manufacturers of waterworks fittings, which are products that are critical to pipelines across the country. By the time the Great Recession hit, we were down to one last remaining domestic manufacturer, and that was us. And we were close to having to close our last plant. But the passage of AIS saved all of those jobs. Not only that, but it gave us the incentive to reinvest in the plant and increase jobs. And more importantly, the very companies that were the architects of the demise of the domestic industry realized that if they wanted to participate in these programs, they had to reshore the production of those products. So they opened up a new plant in Oklahoma, and they're today manufacturing those products that they tried to take over to other countries across the ocean.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Chair. We yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Van Orden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand everybody here has a sense of displeasure with congressionally directed spending at the expense of the state allocations, but I live in a very rural area, and I'll be frank with you, sometimes people play politics with this issue, and I think that's frankly despicable. I submitted several congressionally directed spending things for projects, and my cutoff, like in order of precedence, was clean water was the first one, and then it was public safety. So I get what you're saying, but unfortunately, again, sometimes when the federal government sends monies to state governments, they are allocated in a way that there's a big political thumb on that. And rural areas, of which the 3rd Congressional District of the state of Wisconsin predominantly is, oftentimes are neglected. So I want you to think about that in that context, that we're not throwing stuff around here and trying to take away from the state's ability to allocate funds for clean water. We want to make sure that federal monies are going directly to where they can have the most impact. Is that clear with everybody here? So a lot of things that I hear from my folks that make these projects more difficult to administer is the moving needle from the EPA, especially when we're talking about different levels for agricultural runoff, phosphates, nitrates, and now with the PFAS. So I want to ask you, we'll just start with Ms. Johnson, if that's all right. With the EPA saying that the PFAS are hazardous materials, essentially, a lot of the concerns from our municipal water treatment facilities is that they're going to be held liable some way for not being able to get the water to a clean enough level to a moving standard from the EPA. Have you heard that?
I have not heard that personally. I know communities are used to the ever-changing regulations in the water and wastewater industry, and will do everything they can to meet those compliance requirements.
So when you're saying that because members of Congress who speak directly to our constituents on a daily basis, we're cherry-picking money out of these funds to put them directly where they're needed, add some uncertainty. The same thing financially planning, uncertainty for planning financially, the same thing happens to each one of these municipalities with this moving target. Mr. Swingle, have you heard from folks about the issue of the moving target from the EPA for these different standards? I mean, you're one of the guys, right?
Excuse me?
You're running one of these, correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
What you do for your day job, you're predominantly responsible for conducting these operations, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So then I guess, have you heard this, Mr. Swingle?
We do operate under the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, which is a delegated authority. And so we do have uncertainty about where we will land with PFAS. And in Florida in particular, it's somewhat complex because as a utility, we have eliminated all surface water discharges, but use our treated effluent that is to public reuse standards for replenishing groundwater. And the complexities of that uncertainty associated with the regulatory environment and whether that would be regulated by the MCLs that are proposed on the drinking water side or through ultimately a flow down from EPA on the wastewater side, does create significant uncertainty for us.
So from your perspective, from your position where you're at, if the EPA could be more consistent and upfront and possibly share things on a more regular basis, it would make your job easier?
Regulatory certainty is absolutely critical for utilities when we're making these significant investments.
Outstanding. Just to be clear, we have an entire town, every single well has been contaminated by PFAS because there's a airfield right there on French Island, actually. It's a township of Campbell. It's a beautiful place. Mr. Proctor?
Well, PFAS is actually, obviously a very complex topic, but if I could address your question from the standpoint of the private sector and the people that make the things that are going to be necessary to help resolve the problem. I hear a lot from, one thing that's certain.
Mr. Proctor, you have 17 seconds.
I'm sorry?
You have 15 seconds.
I'm sorry, I still couldn't hear.
My time has expired. I yield back.
Okay.
Mr. Carter?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As a former local and state elected official, I understand the importance of intergovernmental coordination when it comes to protecting precious resources, particularly in the event of a disaster. Right now, in my home state, Louisiana, we're facing impending crisis of saltwater intrusion currently creeping up the Mississippi River. My office has been working in close coordination with the Army Corps of Engineers, state, and the City of New Orleans, and the Sewage and Water Board to combat the saltwater intrusion. What role do you see state and local government playing in preparing for disaster events such as this that may threaten drinking water and the water supply? How can federal agencies help their state and local governments better prepare for these events? Ms. Hammer, could you address that for us?
Thanks for the question. I'm actually not sure I'm positioned to answer that as I don't work on disaster preparedness and response issues. Do any of the other witnesses?
Anybody else want to take a crack at that? Yes, sir. Ms. Proctor.
Well, one thing I would note is the new BRIC program that Congress created, I guess it was back in 2017, provides some terrific opportunities for communities to access funding to address pre-disaster mitigation, including things like saltwater infiltration and that sort of thing. So there are programs out there available to communities, but I think there have been some problems with rolling out some of that BRIC funding over the past couple of years, and if we could eliminate some of those obstacles, that would be another source of resources for communities to address that issue.
Okay. In December 21, the EPA announced that they were providing $275 million in WFIA grant to the City of New Orleans and Sewage and Water Board to modernize the city's aging and storm-damaged water system. With EPA's financing of this project has helped projects historically help project communities in historically underserved areas from the impact of storm events and climate change. How does WFIA expanded eligibility help EPA supplement the CWSRF program?
Part of the testimony that I talked about was a portfolio of funding approaches, and that is absolutely critical. As our particular utility already has a WFIA loan, we are now in the process of our second. But for many smaller utilities, WFIA isn't the right solution, and that's where SRF and WFIA and the community appropriations all come into play to create that portfolio. As utilities, we're reflections of our community, and often the differences in these funding approaches also recognize that flexibility and add to being able, for each community, being able to access funding that's appropriate for their needs.
As our climate rapidly changes due to global warming, drinking water increasingly becomes a more precious natural resource rather. How do we see drought and arid conditions affecting state and local water agencies?
Well, as a state and local water agency, I'll address that. We are very proactive in our planning, both for conservation and diversifying our supplies. Where we were traditionally a groundwater-only entity, We are now diversifying into surface water reservoirs. We are doing extensive groundwater recharge to create future supplies. And so, and that is where also flexibility in the regulatory and funding environment particularly comes into play for us as local utilities.
So with the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, how has BIL's investment into the program helped improve clean water in the states?
The investment through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, while was a historic investment into the Clean Water SRF programs, as I mentioned previously, with the cuts to the regular program, it's really mitigating the effects of those cuts at this point in time, and putting a Band-Aid on it basically for diverting those funds. And so in Oklahoma, we're a leveraged state, so we issue debt to make sure that we meet the capacity and the demand for projects in our state. And so in doing so, the more funds we divert out as grants or loan forgiveness, the less loans that we're able to make to be able to repay that debt.
And all of these critical issues would be further exacerbated with a government shutdown. My
Yes.
time has expired. I yield back.
Mr. Owens, you're recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Proctor, you mentioned in your testimony that clean water infrastructure requires innovation. In what ways do you see the clean water industry looking to innovate?
One area is back to the topic of PFAS. As I mentioned a second ago, that's a very complex topic, and it's going to require a lot of innovation and a lot of new technology from the private sector to be able to address that topic. One concern that many people in the private sector have is that one of the remedies EPA is considering is to designate PFAS a CERCLA constituent. We have a lot of concern about that because that could potentially disincentivize the private sector from getting involved in this topic. If there's a prospect that they could get sucked into extensive and expensive litigation and liability simply by providing some of the solutions, that's a serious disincentive to going down that path. And so as we start to look for the solutions for the PFAS problem, we need to be mindful of unintended consequences.
Good. Ms. Johnson, in your testimony, you outlined several federal mandates that have made costs for clean water projects too expensive, even with funding available. What do you estimate the total extra costs these mandates have added to projects, and would you agree that that these added costs might stifle innovation that Mr. Proctor just mentioned?
So it's very difficult to quantify the cost of federalizing state programs, but there is a cost. Obviously, it takes time and effort to document compliance with all of these federal requirements that may or may not be meeting the intention of the congressional requirement. So while we don't have a statistical data for the actual true cost of the added federal mandates to the program, we do know that it does drive infrastructure costs up.
Okay. With these costs, do you believe there is, because of chosen winners and losers when it comes to receiving funds, and why, if that's the case?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you believe with the cost you're talking about, does this preemptively choose losers and winners in the industry you're part of?
Yeah, increased cost of infrastructure is going to trickle down to the ratepayers in your local communities, especially in the disadvantaged communities where their priority is keeping rates affordable for their, fixed income homeowners.
Okay, I'll just say this, thank you for your innovators, because this is really what makes our country what it is, and obviously here in DC, they have no clue what that looks like. So I love the fact of innovations being a topic. We just have to make sure you can give you the bandwidth to make sure that happens. So thank you, and now you're back.
Thank you.
Ms. Skolton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much to all of our witnesses here today. Congresswoman Hillary Skolton from Michigan's 3rd Congressional District. I'm proud to represent miles of beautiful Lake Michigan shoreline, as well as the Grand River, largest river system in our state. This topic today is so important to me for a number of reasons. Water is a way of life in West Michigan, and not only from providing recreation. My family, we're year-round anglers, but the Great Lakes watershed is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Keeping our water systems healthy and clean is a top priority for me. We've been talking a lot about PFAS contamination, which is a huge problem. Michigan has been leading the way for decades in identifying and remediating PFAS contamination sites throughout our state, and Michigan's 3rd Congressional District is no exception. Mr. Swingle, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more specifically about some remediation efforts that you see possible and where we might be sort of losing the way in addressing this deeply difficult issue. Specifically, how can Congress help clean water agencies address PFAS remediation, and what infrastructure we need to prevent this sort of contamination in the future? It feels like a problem that we continue to throw more and more money at without really solving the problem.
Thank you. Yes, it really has to be a multi-pronged approach because, as you're very well aware, as public utilities, we are passive receivers of this pollution that comes from a variety of sources. As in my testimony, right now, understanding exactly where these are coming from, these pollutants are coming from in our systems, so that we can target those removal of those constituents upstream, it is always more cost-effective to remove at the source rather than when you get to our systems and have the entirety of a flow from an entire community. So as one of the things that I did mention was ensuring that that fix was in place to allow some of that mandatory funding from IIJA to be accessible for that upfront assessment and planning and pretreatment. That's absolutely critical. The other is, because of the timelines associated with PFAS regulation, is ensuring that we do have that regulatory certainty. Utilities across the country will be investing millions and millions, if not billions and billions of dollars, and ensuring that that infrastructure that we build, that we have to make sure that we have in place, that it is effective investments, and again, that ultimately that we're not also responsible for the liability associated with the pass-through of those discharges. But we do face many technology challenges right now. Our systems at that scale right now are not equipped to cost-effectively handle PFAS, and so there's significant research and development on the technology side that's required as well.
Thank you. That was really informative. In the rest of my time, Mr. Proctor, I want to move on to you with a question. Very receptive to the need to potentially extend some of these deadlines for the bipartisan infrastructure law, and you talk about the need for additional technical assistance. Can you speak a little bit more specifically about what kind of technical assistance is needed, how it would be used, and how it would help?
Well, the process for applying for SRF loans and grants can be very arcane sometimes and complex. And typically the utilities that need that assistance the most are the most ill-equipped and lack the expertise to be able to figure out that process. And that's where technical assistance becomes critical. Providing them the resources, the information that they need to be able to take advantage of the funding is a very, very important part of making sure that that money gets where it needs to go. And going back to something I said in my opening comments, the lower the appropriations for the regular allocations to the FSRFs, the less technical assistance is going to be available for those disadvantaged communities. And so I would just reiterate my plea that y'all work with the folks over on the appropriation side to make sure that that money gets there.
Thank you. My time is up. I yield back. Thank you all.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Collins, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I like to start by telling people this is kind of my industry sitting in here because I'm in the transportation, I'm in the trucking business. And so a lot of times I like to focus kind of on what I know a little bit about. And so I want to kind of go into the supply chain issues a little bit. It's obvious that up here, as much as this Congress, anytime you say supply chain, heads turn. So it's been, especially since the pandemic, in the forefront of people's minds, whether they're service providers or manufacturers. And Mr. Proctor, as a manufacturer, I'd love to know how you've been impacted by these supply chain disruptions.
Fairly severely on a number of different fronts. We make ductile iron pipe, ductile iron valves, fittings, that sort of thing. And to give you one example, the war in Ukraine has had a significant impact on our ability to manufacture those products. Russia and Ukraine are the largest, if not the sole sources of magnesium, which is a critical element to the manufacture of those products. And so the war over there has disrupted our supply chain significantly when it comes to those basic raw materials. But the other thing that I want to emphasize is workforce development. When we talk about supply chains, we need to keep in mind the people that actually do the work that produces these products. And we need more people who are willing to come in and help us provide those services, and that's a real challenge for us. And so as you're thinking about things that could be done to not only improve supply chain issues, but also the operation of the utilities themselves, please keep in mind that workforce development and training good folks who want to come in and work for what is really one of the last opportunities for someone without a college education to make a good, solid middle-class wage.
No, I couldn't agree with you anymore. Usually behind supply chain issues is workforce. We always end up talking about workforce. As a matter of fact, we were just talking about it at a meeting I had this morning at 8 o'clock. And you're exactly right. I also sit on natural resources, and when you were talking about critical minerals and the fact that we're 80% dependent on China to process the critical minerals that we need here in this country. And then you factor in the fact that we have an administration that has continually not allowed mining in our own country, much less processing, because we're down to 3 smelters. So I think that's a very important point, that we move our mineral mining, processing right back to the United States and get away from this dependence on some of these countries.
Well, if I could echo that, our products are made from 95% recycled content, which means iron and steel scrap. But the global demand for scrap is such now that it's getting increasingly difficult to find scrap that can go into our processes. What that means is that at some point in time, we're going to have to look to developing iron and steel from mining and refining and other activities like that. And so that's a future issue that's going to become more acute as the years go by.
Well, I got one more question for you. I know I'm getting limited here, but so there's that obviously been an impact on the construction and completion of the projects that you're supplying for, correct?
Yes.
All right. Besides workforce development, is there anything else that Congress can be doing? I know permitting or anything in that area? Absolutely,
and I'll give you one specific example. EPA is currently considering a discretionary review of the PM 2.5 rules. If they ratchet down the PM 2.5 requirements beyond where they are now, it's going to put almost the entire country in a non-attainment situation. And that means projects that would expand capacity and increase jobs and increase the ability of the manufacturing sector to meet the demand for the sort of products that we're going to need to fund all the, to build all these projects is going to be virtually impossible. And, we all want clean air, don't get me wrong. But if you look at the statistics, our air now is the cleanest it's been in 40 years. And it's the cleanest in the world in many respects. So let's make certain that as we're looking at these new regulations and changes, that we keep in mind, that, once again, the unintended consequences.
Yes, sir. Something I like to call common sense. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm out of time. Thank you.
Ms. Sykes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member, for this, and to our witnesses, welcome and appreciate your testimony. One thing that has become very clear is how important the bipartisan infrastructure law is nationwide, not just in my community in Ohio's 13th congressional district. And you've talked about how the Clean Water State Revolving Fund especially is important, and having been a state-level legislator, talked about this quite a bit, and so it's good to see the synergy, or lack of synergy sometimes, between how these programs work. Mr. Swingle, I want to ask you briefly, in your testimony you mentioned the current investments in the Clean Water State Revolving Fund proposed in the House's budget are not adequate. Can you talk about why this proposed funding does not meet the needs of our communities, and what would happen if we funded the Clean Water State Revolving Fund at the proposed fiscal year 24 levels?
Thank you. Yes, we've talked about funding or cost increases that are driven by both the regulatory environment and the inflationary environment. And so as we get to this discussion where there's a reduction in either the Clean Water SRF or just funding in general, that gap has to be widening. And we know the importance of clean water, and when that funding gap exists, there's going to be reductions in whether it's compliance or the ability to meet the needs of the communities.
Thank you for that answer. So it's clear we need to hold up the spirit of the bipartisan infrastructure law and keep investing in those critical programs, not just for my district, but across the country, and including in your community. It's why I was proud to lead a letter with Ranking Member Napolitano to their Appropriations Committee, speaking of that, with 30 of my colleagues earlier this year requesting robust funding for those water infrastructure programs. And also why Representative Nikema Williams of Georgia and I introduced a bill to ensure funding for environmentally friendly water infrastructure projects, working with organizations like the American Rivers to advance bills like the WISE Act would ensure longevity of our infrastructure and the environment and protect these programs to come. So, Mr. Chairman, at this time, I request unanimous consent to submit a report by American Rivers on the Clean Water State Revolving Fund for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hammer, I want to turn to you now. I was drawn to a comment in your testimony and was hoping that you could discuss a little bit further about water affordability and costs. We are all concerned about it. I hear my community members talk about inflation and water. Obviously, affordability is rising to the surface, especially post-pandemic. Most people were not aware that there was such a thing called water shutoffs, and people's water would be shut off for lack of payment. The low-income household water assistance program is vitally important, and you make a suggestion to make this permanent. Can you talk a bit more about that? And I'll just say that this program has helped about 25,000 Ohio households make ends meet, protecting their quality of life and safety. So why would you suggest that we make this pilot program permanent?
Thanks. I really appreciate that question. As I discussed in my written testimony, there truly is an affordability crisis in this country. Some recent studies have found that anywhere between around 10 to 20% of households are experiencing affordability challenges with water and sewer bills. Most utilities do not operate their own low-income assistance programs. In many cases, state law can be a barrier to those, or they simply don't have the resources. And as you mentioned, the LIWAP program that was adopted during the pandemic has made a huge difference for many, many people. It's helped over 1 million households nationwide maintain access to water or sewer service. But of course, it was established as a temporary program, and it is currently about to expire, yet the need is not going away. So we need to address it through the adoption of a permanent program, whether that is LIWAP made permanent or a program at a different agency. We're pretty open to the different options, but any permanent program that makes households automatically eligible for participation if they are already participating in another federal income qualified assistance program. That would really boost participation. Right now, there have been a number of barriers to enrollment that have reduced participation rates.
Thank you so much. And my final question I want to direct to Ms. Johnson. In your testimony, you mentioned in relation to compliance with the Davis-Bacon Act that you did not find that there was an issue. It was, quote, not an issue. This morning, the International Union of Operating Engineers submitted a letter to members of the committee, or shared, I would say, and they identified that there, in fact, is an issue, at least according to their assertion. Over 10,000 workers, upwards of $30 million in wages have not been appropriately dispersed. What is your response to that?
So from my experience with the Davis-Bacon Wage Rate Act is the issue is more of the compliance procedures, not necessarily the wage rates, especially in today's tight labor markets where contractors are having to pay above and beyond the wage rates to attract skilled workers. The actual wage rates are not the issue, but it's actually the burdensome administrative oversight of the act.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I tried to be under my 5 minutes so I could get cheered on too, but I apologize. I yield back.
That's all right. Mr. Ezel, my apologies.
No problem. We do kind of talk alike. So we are from the same area of this country. So
You two sitting down there beside each other.
that's right. So I want to thank all of you for coming today. I know it's a lot going on right now, but I just thank you all for being here today. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity. Mr. Proctor, in previous hearings, I've raised some similar concerns that you highlighted in your testimony. I agree we cannot allow these issues to hinder the improvement of critical water systems in Mississippi and across our nation. One of the issues that both you and I have emphasized is the infrastructure funding passed by Congress and the impending deadlines. As you noted, EPA has not yet recommended water quality criteria or issued effluent limitations guidelines for PFAS. I understand there's a lack of testing capacity for PFAS, and particularly in rural states. How does this affect the state's ability to meet the deadlines placed on these funds?
Well, in the absence of certainty about what targets they're going to have to meet from a regulatory standpoint, as I mentioned earlier, it makes it very difficult to figure out how to design the projects, what technology you need, what systems you need, and that sort of thing. And so the longer that clarity doesn't occur, the more utilities are going to start bumping up against these deadlines. And again, one of the concerns that we have from the standpoint of the people that are going to provide the products that go into that is if we get up against those deadlines and all of a sudden there's a massive surge in demand, that could create bottlenecks that could increase costs to the projects and potentially put the project itself at risk.
Thank you. Given what factors would you recommend for the EPA to consider when planning on requiring testing for PFAS?
I'm sorry.
What would these factors, what would you recommend for the EPA to consider when planning on requiring these testing for PFAS?
Well, I don't really have an opinion on what the standards ought to be. But as I said earlier, it's a very complex topic, and it's something that's going to require a lot of private sector participation to evaluate those standards.
Right. Thank you. We'll move on. Ms. Johnson, EPA recommends that states utilize the full drinking water state revolving fund, 2% small system technical assistance set aside, and the newly available clean water state revolving fund, 2% technical assistance funds to enhance or build programs that proactively identify, engage with, and provide assistance to rural, small, and tribal publicly owned treatment works and drinking water systems, particularly in disadvantaged communities. Have you benefited from these technical assistance dollars?
So the requirement in the Clean Water SRF programs is that the 2% technical assistance, if utilized, has to be utilized to state agencies or nonprofit entities, while in the Drinking Water SRF program, it also allows contracting with private firms and entities to distribute that technical assistance. So many states around the country under the Clean Water SRF programs have technical assistance programs outside of the 2% technical assistance that they have been administering for many years through their administrative fees that they charge on the loans to help their borrowers.
Thank you. And, you know, everybody in here wants clean water. You know, we all do that, and we want to do whatever we can as a Congress to help you and to help us move along. But, you know, sometimes we just got to get through some of this red tape to help these smaller communities like places in my home state. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Hoyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to make a comment as opposed to a question. I've heard through testimony, your testimony, Ms. Johnson, some of my colleagues, where you talk about federal regulation increasing costs. And I think it's really important to be transparent that I believe what you're referring to is Davis-Bacon prevailing wage, among other things. And so I just think it's important that we take a step back as to why we have prevailing wage for projects built with federal dollars. In 1931, the Davis-Bacon Act was passed, and this was a way to ensure that when we use taxpayer dollars, that those dollars were spent for the highest quality work, because we're building things that we want to last for generations. And so what we don't want is for subpar contractors, and as labor commissioner, I worked with business, I worked with labor, and the vast majority of businesses do want to do the right thing, vast majority of contractors. However, there are people that don't. And so if we allow in federal projects and in Oregon on projects that use state dollars to bid just on price, then what happens is you get low bid contractors and bad things happen. More workers die. Those projects don't last. Buildings cave in. It's unsafe. Now, I personally, having run an agency that, you know, had been not invested in 4 decades prior to my coming in, I'm actually very passionate about streamlining government bureaucracy, about making sure that we're not being duplicative, making sure that people can understand government, that again, that we have our federal employees at the Department of Labor or where else having the resources, meaning that they have IT resources, that they have enough people to do the job, that our businesses and our workers can access government easily. That may be an odd thing to be passionate about, but we've all been stuck in places. And I can tell you, I talk to federal employees all the time that are frustrated that they don't have the tools to actually directly do what we need to do. Now, the Biden administration has a final rule that will go into effect next month to ease the compliance burden and reduce some of the duplicative, over-technical nature of complying with the Davis-Bacon laws. And that's important. But what we don't need to do, because I would disagree that we don't need Davis-Bacon anymore because everybody's just going to pay the right wage. Again, coming from a state with little Davis-Bacon and enforcing wage and hour laws routinely, when we would come in and find that there was egregious wage theft on a construction site, too often, so often, we would have workers from states that had right to work for less laws, that didn't understand that they needed to be paid a prevailing wage. So workers do need protections, not because of the vast majority of contractors, but because there are people that would take advantage of the law. But we also aren't going to always have a strong economy, like the kind of economy where you can't find workers, right? So the prevailing wage laws means that the best contractors that have really strong apprenticeship programs, that invest in their workforce safety, that they get to compete, and that our local contractors get to compete instead of having a national low-bid contractor come in. So I agree that we need to reduce the regulatory burden, but in doing that, we should not undermine the protections that Davis-Bacon offers to our taxpayers so that we can get the best value for our taxpayer dollars, the protections that prevailing wage offers to workers, and the benefit that we give to level the playing field for those contractors that will pay more and do better, because we deserve to have the absolute best bang for the buck with our federal dollars. So I just wanted to point that out. I really don't have a question, but I'm happy to work with you on the streamlining piece, but also we have to invest in the agencies we want to do the job, because if you don't have enough people and you don't have the right resources and you're still working on a COBOL system, it's impossible. It is impossible to achieve the things we want to achieve. So it's a both and. Thank you very much.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Duarte.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to be here today. I've been waiting for this committee hearing. Thank you. I represent a community in California, Central Valley, that has a lot of small farm towns with great needs for, of course, California compliance standards on wastewater and drinking water are very, very high. And many of these towns don't have a lot of new growth to put the cost of a new treatment plant onto developer fees. So they've got very few options, very small tax base in many of these farm worker towns. This is a voting rights act district with 2/3 Hispanic voters, and so it's my pride to represent them, but nonetheless we have some challenges. So Ms. Johnson, Mr. Swingle, it sounds like you've got quite a bit of experience with the proverbial honeypots of funding for clean water projects and sewer and wastewater projects, and I'd just like you to survey for me really quick what you think. We spoke to some specific programs today, but where you think some of the different government sources of funding are for these types of projects in smaller rural towns.
So I'm not sure I completely understand the question.
How do aside from the grants we're talking about today specifically, what are the different grant programs and funding sources within the federal government for clean water and wastewater treatment, particularly in smaller rural towns?
Okay. Besides the Clean Water SRF program, I'm aware of some other smaller grant programs, the Sewer Overflow and Municipal Reuse Grant Program, often referred to as OSG Grant Program. I believe there's other programs at other federal agencies. Rural Development has CDBG grants and other grant programs. I'm not sure of all of the funding programs out there. I know Indian Health Services offers grant programs to small communities within their Indian nations.
Okay. Mr. Swingle, you're reaching for it.
Well, and I'd just like to add that I think it's complicated. We've talked about the largest ones today, and that's evident. But there are others, and we'd be happy to follow up and provide what we have as far as an inventory. But I think that is also the complexity of ensuring that these other programs that are in place, that they are accessible and that they truly do meet the needs, which right now, based on the testimony you've heard from throughout this panel, is that the growing needs across the water sector just aren't being met.
So in terms of thank you very much. In terms of federal resources, I also understand that the Clean Water Act has a block grant program that goes to each state individually annually. I know that, understand that California's is over $300 million. Are you familiar with these monies and how they're used in your states? And how would I go about comparing that to what's happening in California? I just have a feeling they're not getting the clean water programs as I would define them.
Yeah, I would encourage you to, reach out to your states for sure on what all funding sources are available to the communities within your states. In Oklahoma, we work collaboratively with other funding agencies in our state to maximize the resources available to our communities. within Oklahoma, and so that they have every opportunity to get either grant or loan funding for their critical infrastructure needs based on their situation. And I know many other states have similar programs.
Yes, thank you. Yes, sir, Mr. Proctor.
As we talk about available resources, one of the things that we shouldn't forget is the opportunity for public-private partnerships. If we can expand the use of those partnerships, that gives us the ability to tap into private sector funding to alleviate a lot of these problems, as well as whatever may be available from the federal government.
Thank you. And Ms. Hammer, you're with the NRDC, Environmental Activist Group, Advocacy Group, let's call it. The San Joaquin Delta of California has 60 municipalities releasing not tertiary treated discharge into the Delta, causing algal blooms and other environmental problems. Is this on your radar? And is your group pressuring for some kind of remedy here?
I am not sure. We have an office in San Francisco that I believe handles California-specific issues, so I'd be happy to consult with them and get back to you.
I'd really appreciate that.
Sure thing.
Thank you to the chair, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hammer, the District of Columbia, like states, has benefited greatly from the bipartisan infrastructure law and clean water infrastructure state revolving funds. You mentioned that the increased frequency of storms caused by climate change is leading to higher pollution in our nation's waterways and thus increased treatment costs for 2/3 of our country's drinking water. The District of Columbia, which I represent, is one such jurisdiction, and DC is wholly reliant on the Potomac River for our drinking water, meaning DC's drinking water is continuously at risk. How can greater transparency in clean water infrastructure financing increase equity for historically marginalized and underserved communities, particularly communities of color that are impacted disproportionately by pollution?
Thanks for that question. So we, NRDC, recently conducted a study looking at the past 10 years of funding decisions under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund program. First of all, I would say that transparency is a challenge with the data through that program. It's very difficult to access project-level information in terms of who is receiving funds. So that was the reason for my recommendation for a public online dashboard that EPA could manage. But the study that we did found that smaller communities and communities with higher populations of color were statistically less likely to receive Clean Water SRF awards during that 10-year period. So it's really important for state SRF program managers to keep that in mind, to assess what are the barriers to participation in the program. Are there policies in place that may be blocking certain communities from accessing funds?
Thank you, Ms. Hammer. You also mentioned that urban flooding currently results in $9 billion in damages each year. What are the benefits of dedicated climate resilience funding for wastewater and stormwater infrastructure in flood-prone areas, and how do the costs compare?
Well, wastewater and stormwater infrastructure are facing a wide range of threats from climate change. Flooding is certainly one. Sea level rise is another. Many wastewater facilities are located right on waterways. And one of the best approaches, there's just more funding is needed in general to help utilities manage those threats. The more dedicated funding we can provide to sustainable green infrastructure, the better. Those approaches are really adaptable, flexible. They can be scaled up or down, unlike hard infrastructure. They can be scaled easily and quickly. They provide multiple benefits to communities, such as reducing the urban heat island effect and others. So we would support dedicated funding, particularly through the continued existence of the Green Project Reserve.
Mr. Swingle, you said that there are currently no available technologies that both effectively and affordably destroy PFAS in drinking water at the scale necessary for public water utilities. How can Congress aid with developing these necessary technologies and ensuring that public clean water utilities can afford them?
That exists on both the clean water and the drinking water side, where there's a need for additional research. And tying into, this is a place where I do very much agree with that private sector to make sure that we've got those private sector partnerships on developing and deploying and validating technologies that can be produced at scale. Because while the technologies are there, they're often not affordable at the scale when we're talking community-wide systems.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. James, you're right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the chair for this opportunity to speak, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being able to make it up to Chapel Hill today and testify in front of this committee regarding the state of clean water infrastructure. Throughout my service, I recognize that we all have a great duty, not just to our service members and veterans, but right here, starting in the District of Columbia, representing the folks in our district, me back in the 10th Congressional District in Michigan. And part of that is making sure that we have the very basic needs met, clean drinking water. I've heard a number of great conversations here today, but I would like to piggyback on my colleagues' last statements. Specifically related to rain and stormwater. 2-inch plus rain events have steadily increased in frequency since 1964. Specifically, there was an 89% increase for the state of Michigan in 1964 and 2013, and a 128% increase for Southeast Michigan. Specifically, for whomever can answer, what types of wastewater treatment projects at wastewater treatment facilities are eligible for CWSRF emerging contaminants funding? Any ideas?
I can try to address that. The CWSRF emerging contaminant funding is a very narrow eligibility under the CWSRF program, but has specific funding through the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. The guidance for that funding was delayed in coming out, and so state SRF programs are trying to understand the particulars with administering those funds currently. They're quite prescriptive from what we've been told, and that the CWSRF programs cannot use the funding for monitoring to detect emerging contaminants, and so that an emerging contaminant would have had to have been previously detected in order to use those funds. And without those being regulated contaminants, a lot of, especially small communities, are not actively testing for those contaminants. Additionally, the CWSRF emerging contaminant funding is not allowed to be used for detecting the source of contamination. So once identified, they can't use the funds to figure out where it's coming from. So the Clean Water
That's
SRF
interesting, Ms. Johnson. I'm going to have to look into that. Thank you. One more quick question in the limited time that we have. After speaking with my colleague and former Representative Candace Miller, discussing combined sewage overflow projects in order to fully protect Michiganders from increasingly devastating floods, we've determined that nearly $181 million in design and construction will be needed to protect our homes. This includes nearly $70 million for the 9-mile emergency bypass rehabilitation, $22 million for electrical system replacements, and nearly $30 million for canal rehabilitation in our district alone. In the minute and a half, anybody who can answer, what kinds of planning and assessment activities are eligible for the CWSRF as we examine this moving forward?
The CWSRF programs can fund a wide range of planning activities. Some of the problems with using those funding sources for planning activities is the federal procurement requirements for engineering services. Oftentimes, the state and federal requirements for procuring those services contradict each other, and so compliance with procuring services doesn't always, in a state, doesn't always meet the federal requirements, so they use funding sources outside the CWSRF to utilize for their planning efforts.
Thank you very much. I know the chairman shares my passion for regulatory reform and streamlining, so excited to work with the chairman and my colleagues on that. With that, sir, thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you drive up to my hometown from Boston, you go along this beautiful beach right between Lynn and Swampscott. It's called King's Beach, literally fit for a king. And yet it's closed 90% of the time. It's the most polluted beach in Massachusetts. Now, Lynn is a majority-minority community, and you'll often see families out there, even when the beach is closed, because it's the only beach they have access to at all. So it's a major issue for the community. The problem is that with most of the clean water funding available through the bipartisan infrastructure law and other legislative vehicles only available as loans, many local governments just don't have the tax base large enough to pay them back. And Massachusetts doesn't have a county system anymore, so it's hard to coordinate different cities and towns working together, although Lynn and Swampscott are moving in that direction. So, Mr. Swingle, what should we be doing to support a more regional approach to water quality issues like those that are plaguing Kings Beach? And what mechanism would you suggest we use when our current system is so segmented?
So across the water sector, I think part of this is ensuring that we have organizations and use organizations like NACWA for best practice sharing. We have many large utilities across the country that do have expertise and capabilities, and in my state in Florida, through our association, which is the Florida Water Environment Association Utility Council, we do a lot to help and provide those that resourcing in terms of just assistance and consultation for smaller utilities. So I think that is very important on state levels, is utilities helping utilities and working together and creating partnerships with the regulatory environment. The second piece that I emphasize that remains absolutely critical is that diversity of funding approaches. I don't believe that there's any singular funding approach that will work for everyone. And so having funding approaches that make sense for the different communities that we serve and their differences is absolutely critical in order to be successful to address the situations that are.
Ms. Hammer, I want to ask about this specifically. Picking up on where Mr. Swingle left off, what should we be doing to ensure that federal infrastructure funding is accessible for environmental justice communities like Lynn in the amount required to make a difference?
Thanks. As we've discussed a few times today, it's extremely important that funding continue to be available in the form of additional subsidization, grants, and principal forgiveness that doesn't have to be repaid, which is the only option for many communities that can't afford a loan. Technical assistance is also incredibly important. A number of communities don't have the on-staff resources to navigate the process. Preparing an application for SRF assistance can cost tens of thousands of dollars. So the more technical assistance resources that we can provide to EPA, to other providers, would make a huge difference.
So we also, in Massachusetts, have a big issue with combined sewage overflows. We've heard that brought up by several of my colleagues today already. North of Kings Beach is the Merrimack River, and I've got 6 towns in my district that the Merrimack River flows through. And as we are having more frequent bad rainstorms with climate change, there are a lot more CSO events. And it's a real problem. And a lot of these, the upriver towns that are not necessarily in my district but contribute to the problem here just don't have the money to upgrade their sewage systems to handle this. So, Ms. Hammer, I'm glad to see that the bipartisan infrastructure law authorizes a program specific to combine sewage overflow issues. But can you comment on how that program works and how it could help my district and other districts upstream on the Merrimack River?
We were also really glad to see that program get included. It has taken a really long time to get it up and running. Why
has it taken so long to get it up and running?
I'm not entirely sure. I know that the amount of funding that was authorized for it was, appropriated for it was a lot less than was authorized. So getting that appropriation level up would be helpful, but just administrative delays.
And are there ways that we should expand the program as well?
Sorry?
Are there ways we should expand the program as well?
Expand the program? I don't have any specific recommendations on that right now other than increased appropriations.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Chairman Rouser and Ranking Member Napolitano. These hearings are obviously very important as you work towards keeping that record going on getting a WRDA bill done, and I look forward to being part of that. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Johnson, I come from your neighboring state of Arkansas, represent a rural district, and the areas in Arkansas are much like the areas in Oklahoma. And I wanted to ask you your thoughts on how the current structure of the Clean Water SRF better serves rural areas like ours than opposed to some kind of federally mandated system.
Thank you for the question. Yes, Oklahoma is a very rural state, and we've been funding projects in rural Oklahoma for the past 30 years, not just with the recent attention on small disadvantaged communities. Those communities are the backbone of rural states across the nation and definitely are in need of funding. The Clean Water Act already authorizes the SRF programs to utilize 10% of the funding for additional subsidization and with a maximum of 30%. The additional in the appropriations bill is generally duplicative, but states already have the authority to do that. And it's a state issue, and states understand the affordability challenges within their states and know where to direct those fundings to. One thing I will say about small rural communities is that they're resilient, but their priorities are different than the larger communities. While larger communities have processes in place for fiscal sustainability, small communities are trying to maintain compliance and not raise the rates for their households within their communities. And so it is a challenge for those communities, but increasing grant programs through the SRF program, while it's great for the recipients of those grants, but it increases the cost to small or disadvantaged communities that didn't get a grant by having to raise our interest rates because of the lack of loans coming back into the program because it's going out as grant funding.
Thank you. And one of the suggestions you made for streamlining compliance really caught my attention. I just want to read this. It's your first bullet point in your testimony on suggestion. It says, to modernize the contract threshold and index the threshold to inflation. Davis-Bacon applies to water infrastructure projects that cost more than $2,000, a threshold that hasn't been updated since the law was enacted in 1931. You said for context, the average cost of a water infrastructure project in a small community, which is fewer than 10,000 people, was $1.8 million in 2022. I first learned about this by working with the folks at the Corps of Engineers on the MCARNs, and I was shocked when I found out that to change the tires on a backhoe, you had to put out a formal bid, and something that would cost maybe $2,500, you end up literally spending $15,000, and most of that's paperwork. The cost for the tires on the backhoe is the same that it would be if you just went and got new tires on your backhoe. So when further investigation on this, between 2018 and 2020, just in the Little Rock and Tulsa districts, had this threshold been adjusted for inflation, which it was 2,031, if it were, I think it would have been 36,000 at that point and up 40,000 or more now, it would have saved $18 million over a 2-year period. Can you speak to that more and talk about how, and the reason I tried to put this in WRDA last time and it got rejected because people thought it was going to affect Davis-Bacon. This has nothing to do with the wage rates. It has to do with raising the limit that you can purchase without having to go through a formal bidding process.
Yeah, there's definitely a need for modernizing the compliance procedures for not only Davis-Bacon, but other federal requirements. Like you said, it's not about the wages, it's about compliance of these requirements. In Oklahoma, we had a community that had to turn back federal funding because literally the project covered 2 different wage rate areas. So while they were working on one side of the street, they had to be in compliance with one wage rate, and while on the other side of the street, they had to be in compliance with a separate wage rate. So this is a mid-sized community that, you know, had sophisticated processes for compliance and still wasn't able to get it right. So as we've mentioned several times today, it's really needs to be streamlined and modernized.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Garabindi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The rather important hearing, considering where the appropriation process is going. We ought to be pretty much aware that this is likely to be pie in the sky, dream on, if the appropriations that are proposed by my colleagues on the Republican side actually happen. So let's dream on for a few moments. We've got some dreams that we'd like to put forward. This question is for you, Mr. Proctor. This past January, I reintroduced my bipartisan Clean Water State Revolving Fund Parity Act with Congressman Bost of Illinois. This would expand eligibility for the U.S. EPA State Revolving Fund program to privately owned wastewater treatment systems, but only to that portion of money that we would hope would be allocated in the future over and above the present $1.63 billion fund. So, Mr. Proctor, do you agree, I hope, that Congress should also provide low-cost federal financing loans that would be repaid with interest to help modernize the wastewater treatment systems for those millions of Americans that rely upon privately owned systems?
Excuse me. I do. I think there are somewhere around 35,000 water systems across the country, 85% of which serve fewer than 10,000 people. And they simply lack the resources to be able to take care of all the needs for their customers. And one of the things that could alleviate that concern would be allowing public-private partnerships, allowing private entities to come in and access some of that funding to provide additional resources. And not only that, regionalization, which I think is sort of related to what your bill addresses, is a way to increase scale that would bring more resources to solve the problem as well. You know, one other thing that I would mention is of those 10,000 or of those small utilities that are out there, many of them are in non-compliance because they do lack the expertise and resources. But there's a poison pill out there that prevents those, the private sector from coming in to provide assistance, and that is that if a private sector entity, or for that matter, a public sector entity, comes in and takes over or assists with the operation of that utility, they could incur whatever past liabilities, penalties, whatever may have accrued from past sins.
Well,
And so providing some form of safe harbor for larger utilities that come in a Good Samaritan role to help these smaller utilities would eliminate that as an obstacle.
Additional work to be done, for sure, and we'll pick that up. The bill that we're proposing, and we'd hope it would be included in the markup from this House, is Word a bill, so that we can then negotiate with the Senate, which is always a good idea. This next question goes to you, Ms. Johnson. The Council of Infrastructure Financing Authorities has yet to chime in on this brilliant piece of legislation that Mr. Brolst and I are putting forward. Would you like to opine today on your position in support of, hopefully, this legislation? Yes, indeed, I am trying to set up a system in which this might be included in a bill that we might take up in markup.
Yeah, CFA does not oppose the expansion of the Clean Water SRF eligible entities to include private. Ultimately, states will have to make the decisions on if they fund to public or private entities.
Yeah, if they have the opportunity. And once again, this would be money over and above the present level of appropriations. So it would be the additional money, which we would hope be included, but right now it appears as though we're going in the opposite direction. This next question goes to, well, I'll put the question out there, and Mr. Swingle, good luck answering. The annual appropriation has remained stagnant for the last 30 years. This was the opening statements that all of you made. We cannot solve this problem if we don't have additional money, and if we're going backwards and reducing the appropriations, it's going to get a whole lot dirtier out there. Would you agree with that, Mr. Swingle?
Yes, we support the increasing investment in clean water. It is absolutely critical to our communities.
And I heard you opine earlier that going the opposite direction would create a significant issue of contamination. Thank you very much. Yield back.
Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panelists. In my district, occurred almost 5 years ago, was something called the Camp Fire, which destroyed the town of Paradise, about 150,000 acres, 20,000 buildings, caused evacuation of about 50,000 people, and most tragically, 85 deaths. So we're working hard to help that town rebuild and recover and actually eventually be stronger than it was. So they need to be equipped in the future to do so. So just to set the scene, Paradise is a town on a ridge above the town of, a larger town of Chico in Butte County, California. Chico, being larger, has a college, more resources, etc. So after Paradise endured what was called the Camp Fire, priority became connecting their wastewater system to a centralized wastewater solution down in Chico. The two towns are cooperating on a regional system that'll benefit both in that setup. So a pipeline would be needed to run from Paradise up on the ridge, southwest, approximately about 18 linear miles to the city of Chico for their plant. So for the town of Paradise, the lack of a sewer system has hampered their economy for decades, and especially post-fire. And post-fire, it has helped stall the recovery efforts that they're seeking. So they're trying to build an affordable system, but it's difficult to develop and improve without affordable housing, but without the system of sewers to do so, it's really hard to do a high density. And as you know, from replacing septic with a system like this, it has a better potential to improve groundwater or not have groundwater be harmed, as sometimes septic can do. So there have been multiple funding sources that come for this project from federal and state government. We are seeking the federal funds through the connection payment, just under $15 million through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Unfortunately, the connection was ineligible for funds as it was not seen as an upgrade to the system. So there's a push and a trend towards increasing regionalization like we're talking about with these two towns. and consolidation of wastewater treatment facilities. So regionalization would save considerable money, have economies of scale, and improve the overall operation. It seems like a good trend where it fits the folks involved. So in this case, they both agree it's best for this locality. And what we're finding, though, that the the revolving fund was not set up to incentivize this particular instance. So I've heard of other instances where certain projects are ineligible because they're not explicitly upgrading the system, as I mentioned. So the bottom line, have any on the panel heard of these situations where a project would not be a benefit, where the would-be benefit was not eligible for the funds? I'm sorry. So what were the reasons the project would be ineligible? Have you heard of this sort of thing? You want to start, Ms. Johnson, Ms. Swingle?
In the Clean Water SRF programs, I know regionalization's a local decision. I'm not aware of why, with the particulars of that particular project, to say whether or not.
Well, other instances where regionalization or the ineligibility that they aren't able to pull down the revolving funds. Have you heard of other instances like that?
Of where regionalization is eligible?
Yeah.
Yeah, consolidation and regionalization, as far as I am aware, is an eligible activity. Of course, these are state-run programs and have state requirements to follow as well. So, again, not aware of the particulars of this project. I can't say for certain on why they would
I'm just wondering in
determine
general.
it ineligible.
Let me go to Mr. Swingle, please. Thank you.
Yes.
Are you hearing of, because of a regionalization, it doesn't meet the upgrade criteria?
And that is not something that I have the details on, whether there's on specific eligibility for that type of activity.
Okay. Mr. Proctor?
I don't have any details on that as well. The one thing I would note, though, is I think this, in part, is something that Mr. Garamendi's bill would address, is that your private utilities currently, because they're ineligible for clean water SRF funding, if they do decide to come in and partner with a public utility, any outstanding SRF loans have to be paid back immediately. And that is a substantial barrier to those sort of assistance efforts.
Okay. I had already burned through the time, so thank you, panelists. We shouldn't have this barrier, because even though regionalization is a plus, it should also be considered an upgrade to the overall system. Indeed, you're getting overall improvements and better water quality, so we need to look at how we can improve that eligibility and help towns like that. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. DeSagne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member and panelists. It's interesting following two neighbors, Northern Californians, Mr. Garamendi and Mr. LaMalfa, both who are good friends, and I have stories I can share, and they can have some for me too as well. But in the context of this hearing, Mr. Garamendi and I represent portions of the Delta, both of us different times in our careers in redistricting. So, Ms. Hammer, in the context of the state and local title of this hearing, in Northern California and California in particular, we have been working on the challenges for climate change and our economy and our workforce and our environment for a long time. Certainly in the Delta, protecting our levees, we know that a lot of them were engineered and built a long time ago. So all of this, there's a synergy. Fortunately, we prepared. We've got the issue in Southern California with the Colorado River and our partnerships. But my question to you first is, because we've prepared, and not enough, we can spend this money, the $50 billion from the infrastructure bill. We're more prepared. We've got more oversight in many ways. Other parts of the country do, reflecting their constituency. And in the current budget request by the administration, we're increasing by $270 million our infrastructure for clean water. But if the appropriations bill is currently constructed, there'd be a 67% cut. So in the context of your background, preparing for future generations, preparing for clean water, in a complicated environment, we can't back away. Any kind of interruption has serious consequences. And to the other conversation about workforce development, Mr. Proctor, maybe if we have time, you can chime in on this. Our experience with my local districts in the Bay Area is we have a workforce because of our Davis-Bacon and stronger provisions, and non-union contractors can compete as well if they want to invest in apprenticeship programs. But we're going into high schools and recruiting people in the building trades, the operating engineers, a lot of disadvantaged kids. So that's a challenge, but where we really have a challenge is on the professional side, where we're trying to get kids into engineering schools. We have partnerships with the University of California because we don't have enough. So that's a long-winded first part is, how do we prepare for the environment we're in so that we can avoid the cost, as Mr. LaMalfa talked about, these catastrophic climate-induced challenges, whether it's paradise or whether it's flooding throughout the country?
Of course, climate change is something that all communities need to be preparing for. Speaking of wildfire, just the wildfires that just happened in Hawaii had significant impacts on water and wastewater systems in Maui. Going to be very expensive to address. One thing I haven't heard, we've been talking a lot about wet weather impacts of climate change, but one thing we haven't discussed as much today is drought. And there are a number of projects that could be eligible for clean water SRF funding to address drought, such as water reuse and recycling projects, which tend to be very cost intensive. So we do need to keep the funding levels up enough to support these important projects that are going to help communities continue to be resilient into the future. And then, in the past, we've also supported proposals to have applicants consider climate impacts as they're planning and designing projects. If they're receiving federal funds, that they should, could be required to take a look at how climate change might affect the design of the project that they're applying for funding for. That's something we would continue to support.
Mr. Proctor, I want to ask you something just that you triggered. But first off, I just had a meeting with my Blue Green Alliance folks, and it's working. Even without the regulation, we're making a business argument that we can transition, and a lot of this is on the air quality side. Mr. Proctor, the question about, in California, it used to be a north-south argument about water, now it's more east-west. A lot of the stuff that we did in the legislature, the agricultural industry is actually moving to be more efficient about reuse, and it's benefiting them from a financial standpoint. So we still want to protect them and almond farmers like Mr. LaMalfa to a certain degree, but we also want to be ready for the change. I wonder if you could opine on just the business model of reuse and more efficient use of water, particularly for the business community.
Well, I can give you a concrete example of how industry can be creative on this point. We have a plant in New Jersey that has a complete stormwater capture system. It captures all the stormwater that falls on our plant site. It recirculates it, it treats it, and then uses that water in the manufacturing process so that we don't have to use potable water or other pressure resources like that. And so there are a lot of opportunities out there to do just that. Water reuse generally, whether it's in industrial applications like I was talking about, or using gray water for other applications, flushing toilets, that sort of thing, are all important ways to try and conserve what we recognize as an increasing scarce resource, clean water.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate our panelists being here today. Seeing no other member that hasn't already had an opportunity to comment and ask questions, I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. The subcommittee stands adjourned.